let's kick things off. So hello to everybody. My name is Drea Maybe. I am the Public Relations and Communications intern with Northern Colorado Clean Cities. If you aren't familiar with our organization, we're a nonprofit that operates in the northernmost parts of Colorado, helping communities and businesses and municipalities transition away from petroleum and toward cleaner alternative fuels. A lot of our work involves community outreach and education about electric vehicle adoption. And we get a lot of questions about how sustainable or how equitable EVs are and other alternative fuels. So we wanted to address some of these concerns more directly in a series of EV equity webinars. Another note, this webinar will be recorded. Thank you, Amy, for starting that. So before we jump into any content, we have a quick poll for you. Joe, if you want to launch that poll, just a few questions to get things started. So just a few questions to gauge interests and opinions, just starting off. If everyone sees that and can give an answer, that'd be awesome. And there was a question in the chat, if the recording will be made available later. Yes, we plan on sending a follow-up email in the next few days after the event so that you can all have access to the recording and watch it later or send it to colleagues, whatever you wish.
All right, looks like we got about 70% of the vote in. A couple more seconds.
Yeah, we're getting a pretty good response rate. We'll give people just a little bit longer. All right, we might be capping out about there, Joe. You want to close that, share the results? Awesome. So first question, what do you see as the biggest barrier to EV adoption? Price, always a big one. Range anxiety and lack of infrastructure also top of mind for a lot of people. It's something we see a lot in our community outreach. Second up, what, in your opinion, are the greatest benefits of EVs? Obviously, environmental benefits and sustainability, always up there, along with improving air quality. We'll definitely be addressing some of the complexities around these things later in the webinar. Third question, what are your most pressing questions or topics about EVs that your community and stakeholders are interested in? Charging infrastructure, that's a huge one. We do a lot of work with that, but obviously still need a lot of work to be done. Yeah, this one's pretty all over the board, but yeah, another big one, especially here in Colorado, changes in temperature and landscape, also of concern. Great, well, thank you everybody for sharing your answers there. We'll move right along here. Joe, if you want to go to the next slide. So right off the bat, obviously these topics of sustainability and equity and EVs in general, those are all really broad and complex topics. And the goal here is we want to spend, we could spend a lifetime talking about these, but the goal here is to spend a little bit of time today scratching the surface of these issues with the hopes of sparking some interesting conversations both here today and beyond within your own networks once we leave this virtual space today. So there are still many barriers to greater and broader EV adoption, like we just identified in the poll. And these barriers have significant environmental and equity impacts. So like, how can we start making EVs more affordable? Price was the #1 concern that you all had today. How can we make them more commonplace, more accessible, and more applicable for all kinds of work and lifestyles for people around the country? Another major question we get a lot is how EVs are powered. Are EVs that are powered with coal energy just as sustainable as those powered with wind or solar energy? We all know that reducing vehicle emissions are good for the environment, but how are these benefits felt across communities in other parts of Colorado or in other parts of the country? Are they equal everywhere? And one of the other most common questions that Northern Colorado Clean Cities in particular gets concerns EV batteries. What kinds of materials and processes go into the production? And how are those batteries recycled or processed at the end of life? And who's responsible for these things? And what kind of impacts do these things have on the world around us? So hopefully we can cover some or most of these questions today. Obviously there's a lot, and obviously they're all really, they provide a depth of interesting topics. But hopefully we can start scratching the surface, like I said, and move forward within all of our own spheres of influence to speak confidently to all of these skepticisms and hopefully spark some more interesting discussions. Sustainability and equity obviously go hand in hand, and it's no different within the context of EVs. And so we hope to bring all these connections together today with our presentations. So Joe, you want to go to the next slide? So a brief agenda of today's event. We'll be hearing from 4 really amazing speakers, all of whom are experts in their field and have been engaging in some really cutting edge research about the sustainability and equity of EVs. So first we'll hear from Jared Kelly and then Linda Gaines from Argonne National Laboratory. They'll be talking a little bit about the research they've been doing concerning battery production and recycling. We'll also hear from Jason Quinn, and he'll be discussing some new exciting technologies to make EVs more sustainable and more efficient in their charging. And lastly, but not least, we will hear from Jesse Burkhart, who will be presenting on how different configurations of the grid and configurations of energy can impact the sustainability and the benefits of EVs. So without further ado, Joe, do you want to move to the next slide, and we'll get started with Jared's presentation. Jared from Argonne National Labs, take it away.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. It took me a minute to get unmuted. Sorry about that. So I'll just jump right into it and talk about sort of the big picture here. Is like, are these things sustainable? These are the questions that we get asked all the time. And it's what we've been addressing for quite a while at Argonne. We've been investigating electrified vehicles in one way or another for many, many years. And so if we go to the next slide, the question is, how do we do this? What is the tool by which we address this issue of sustainability, and what do we even mean by it? We use what's called life cycle analysis, which everybody's familiar with the concept of sort of a biological life cycle. We can think the same way about any sort of produced system. And, you know, there's the birth of that system, the use of it, and then the retirement or end of life, right? So we go through that entire process. And more specifically, on the next slide, at Argonne, we have a tool called GREET, which stands for Greenhouse Gases, Regulated Emissions, and Energy Use in Technology. That tool allows us to look at all of the energy and materials that are associated with all of the energy and materials that go into cars, right? So you have gasoline in a conventional combustion engine vehicle. And that gasoline is extracted from the earth, it's processed, it's refined, it's moved to a distribution site where it's then, you know, eventually put into your vehicle, and then you drive it. Your vehicle is comprised of lots of different materials, a lot of steel, a lot of aluminum, things like that. But now, as we talk about battery electric vehicles, we also have battery materials that we have to be concerned about. And so we look at all of those. We have all of that information available from public documents, from technical analyses that we've conducted, and organization with OEMs, original equipment manufacturers of vehicles, with a lot of industry groups and things like that. So if we go to the next slide. When it comes to batteries, the big issues that we're seeing are lithium, nickel, and cobalt. The 2 main battery chemistries that we're seeing in light-duty vehicles are variances of the NMC, which is short for nickel, manganese, cobalt. So the precursor to all of those is that there's a lithium in front. So it's lithium, nickel, manganese, cobalt oxide cathodes. But the variance of NMC is just how much nickel, manganese, and cobalt are relative to each other. The other is NCA, which is nickel, cobalt, aluminum. And those are the Tesla batteries. So just so you know that what we're looking at, those are the different chemistries. So most folks, I think, at this point have started to hear something about the issue of cobalt. It's a key element in those different battery chemistries. And there's a worldwide effort to reduce it for a number of reasons. One is that it's mostly sourced from a politically fraught environment, that being the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has political issues, human rights issues, and all of those things outside of any sort of moral observation on any of it, it creates volatility. And the last thing that OEMs want is volatility in prices. They like assurances. And so that's one issue. And it also creates potential for scarcity. So those are things that are a concern. Now, one of the good things about the variance in these NMC chemistries that I talked about is that as you go towards higher nickel content, what we call nickel-rich batteries, you actually get an increase in energy density. And so that's a positive for consumers. But there are also potential issues with nickel as a scarcity issue. And that comes from the types of nickel that are available. And nickel is produced from a couple different types of ore bodies, and those have differences in the environmental impacts of those resources. So that's sort of the first life, that's the virgin sort of extraction of these products, but there's also the potential for recycling. And my colleague, Linda, will talk about that after I'm done. And we have some efforts going on with that at Argonne called Resell, and there's a lot of other institutions worldwide that are looking at battery recycling. So next slide. So like I mentioned, we look at this issue of sustainability by using life cycle analysis. And what I'm showing here are two plots. One is showing the energy consumption of a couple different types of vehicles, and the other is showing life cycle SOx emissions. And SOx is a precursor to acid rain. So just to keep those in mind. I'll have you focus on the left figure to start. And what you see here is a comparison of an ICEV vehicle, which is an internal combustion engine vehicle, compared against two different battery chemistry BEVs, battery electric vehicles. So an NMC 111 chemistry and an NCA battery chemistry. Those are relatively comparable, you can see, in terms of their total life cycle energy consumption, but they break out differently between the ICEV and the different battery vehicles. And you can see the battery vehicles, when we consider a US average electrical grid, have about the same energy consumption as, have less energy consumption than an ICEV. But what we can see is that light blue bar represents what we call the vehicle cycle. So all of the energy that went into producing the battery. And there's the darker blue, which is all of the energy that went into producing the rest of the car. Additionally, we have two different ways of looking at the fuel cycle. So the energy that's the use phase energy. And we call that the well to pump. So that's all of the stuff that happens prior to, if we think about it this way, gasoline getting into your car. And then the darker orange bar is the combustion of the gasoline in your vehicle. We don't have that combustion when we're talking about electricity. So that all is moved to what we call the well to pump stage. Caveat is that, of course, where you charge matters. So if you're charging your vehicle in California, for instance, that energy consumption is lower. And what I can also highlight here is that generally we would couple greenhouse gas emissions and energy. That if you plot those bars, they generally look pretty comparable. But greenhouse gas emissions, as you decouple from carbon sources, so coal, natural gas, et cetera, and you move towards hydropower, you move towards solar, wind, whatever, you're reducing your greenhouse gas emissions. And so then if we were to go to a place like West Virginia, that's going to increase emissions. On the right-hand side, I'm showing SOx. SOx emissions are associated with the production of, in this case, nickel. And that's because there's one particular part of the world where they're really bad at controlling SOx emissions, and that's Russian nickel production. So they're a dominant player in that, and so that's why that's large. That is not something that needs to be that way. If you get the same nickel from Canada, you don't have this issue. And so that's sort of a technical or regulatory shortcoming for one place in the world that has an outsized effect. And I present these two slides, or these two figures, to highlight something. If anybody tells you that there is, they are more sustainable, they're not telling you the whole story, because it's always a multifaceted answer. Sustainability is always multifaceted. So there are multiple. Are we talking about greenhouse gas emissions? Are we talking about SOx emissions? Or what are we talking about? So we have to be very careful in how we talk about it. And I think sustainability being lumped as a single term can be oversimplification. Next slide, please. So we've looked then also at the issue of equity, and in particular, how used plug-in electric vehicles can be a form of improving low-income household mobility. So how can this be a platform? And what are the barriers towards this low-income household mobility through used PEVs? And what are the potential incentive programs out there? Next slide. So just broadly speaking, this figure was developed by one of the researchers at Argonne, showing simply the savings that Americans households received over the course of just 2-year stock weighted differences of the vehicles that are operating in the US. And so this isn't related to electric vehicles, but what you can see is that $8.2 billion were saved in just use phase spending by Americans just from 2018 to 2016, based on improvements in fuel economy. And you can imagine that if you have an ICV, that you're going to improve significantly more if you move up to a battery electric vehicle, because their electricity is less expensive, and on a use phase basis, they're less expensive to operate. Next slide. We've also done a variety of other examinations looking at affordability of driving in different parts of the US. And this is just a plot showing fuel spending by household. And so what you're seeing here, what this highlights is this one arrow points to the point where 33% of households in the US spend more than 3% of their household income on vehicle fuel costs. And this is just showing how that varies by the amount of household income spent and by location. So I've highlighted Colorado here, since this is ostensibly for Northern Colorado Clean Cities. Next slide, please. So when it comes to used PEVs, a little more specifically, the issue here that sort of motivates some of this is zero vehicle households are most likely to exist for those households that are at or below the poverty level, the federally mandated identified poverty level. And so the thing that we know about transportation is that it's crucial, right? It's crucial to obtaining important services and amenities. And I think most critically is it's really imperative to be able to get to employment. So that's one critical aspect of why this is something that we're very interested in. The other thing I think that helps motivate this is, as I sort of alluded to before, is that the operations and maintenance costs of plug-in electric vehicles are lower than they are for ICEVs, and significantly lower, meaningfully lower. Next slide. Now, it was nice that everybody was concerned about the price of vehicles, and the other thing that people are concerned about is range, right? So what I'm showing here is just a rough sort of plot showing price and range, right? The longer range you get, the more expensive those vehicles tend to be when it comes to BEVs. Modern EVs are dramatically increasing range for the vehicles, so that range anxiety is definitely something that's being reduced, but price is still an issue. Now, if we look at the used EV market, I just went and looked at Carfax, grabbed a nationwide, just looked at the whole thing, and look at 2017 Nissan Leaf compared to 2017 Toyota Corolla. Everything that I looked at was under 300 or 30,000 miles with no accidents, and what were the lowest available sort of pricing groups, not just sort of like a one-off that's really cheap, but like pricing groups. And you can get a 2017 Nissan Leaf for $9,000. You can get a 2017 Corolla of the same specs basically for $11,000. So you're actually able to get into a used PEV for less money than you can get into a used ICE. And I'm not saying that $9,000 isn't a lot, especially as I was highlighting for households at the poverty level. But it does highlight that they're not, if we're talking about used EVs, they don't have the same sort of, they may not have the same sort of burden of upfront costs that we think of when we think of BEVs. Next slide. The other really, really big issue that's been highlighted over and over again is the availability of charging, right? So charging is largely something that's available to households that are, single family detached households and some sort of, attached kind of household opportunities. But when we think about apartments, when we think about multi-unit dwellings, those are more likely correlated with low-income households, and they're the least likely to have available charging. And so the only thing available to those folks is public charging. And so expanding charging availability at multi-unit dwellings is one thing that can be highlighted as a must-do if we want to talk about opportunities for increasing equity in this area. And I highlight that, but I think it's also important to really important to engage with those communities to make sure that those are addressing their needs. Next slide, please. So the last slide I'm showing is just to highlight, this is a bit of a shameless pitch for an Argonne tool called the Evolution tool, which is, it's an easy to use tool to compare up to 2 light-duty vehicle powertrains with traditionally fueled vehicle, and it gives consumers comparisons of fuel efficiency, total cost of ownership, environmental benefits, and it's all based on zip code and driving patterns. And so that draws on a lot of fueleconomy.gov data, AFDC information, and things of that sort. So that's all I've got for now. Got a million people we could thank and acknowledge on this, but broadly speaking, we're funded by DOE, and we're very, very thankful for the support of DOE and the work that we do. Linda?
Awesome. Thank you, Jared. So yeah, as you said, Linda's up next. Linda Gaines is a chief scientist of the new Resell Center for Advanced Battery Recycling and a transportation systems analyst at Argonne National Lab. She holds a BA in chemistry and physics from Harvard and a PhD in physics from Columbia. Her primary interest is problem solving applied to efficient use of resources. She began her career by writing handbooks of energy and material flows in major industries that enable later studies of technical and institutional issues involved in recycling, discarded tires, packaging, automobiles, and most recently, batteries, which is what we'll be talking about primarily today. She's an editor for the journal Sustainable Materials and Technologies. So with that, Linda, would you care to take the floor, please?
Thank you, Drea. Next slide, please. I'll try to go reasonably quickly. One of the questions that we were asked is kind of how long batteries last and what happens to them along the life cycle. So on the x-axis in this graph is the capacity of the battery. It's how much energy it can hold. And when you have a new car, it can hold 100% of the energy that it's rated at. As you use the vehicle and its capacity decreases, and eventually it gets down to about 70%. And the conventional wisdom is that when your car can't go the 200 miles, but it can only go, let's say, 150 miles, you're going to want to trade it in. You may not really. You may be perfectly happy to keep it. But that's the sort of story that the manufacturers tell you. At that point, the battery can be put back in as a replacement for an older car if there's a problem, or you can use it in stationary energy storage. And that's the second life that people are usually talking about. And at this point, people don't really know how long they'll last in second life. Might be 5 or 10 or 15 years. And it probably depends on how demanding that application is as well. Eventually, though, it's not going to be able to even hold enough energy to be useful for stationary storage. And at that point, the question is, can you recycle it? And what do you do with it then? Next slide. And this is all consistent with the circular economy. You want to be able to keep materials in use as long as you can to be minimizing the life cycle impacts of whatever it is you dug out of the ground and have been using. So reusing something is a lower impact activity than breaking it apart and recycling it. Next. So I need to explain a little bit about what a lithium-ion battery looks like. On the upper left-hand corner is a cross-section of a cylindrical cell. That cell's about the size typically of bigger than a AA, maybe more like a size A battery. It's composed of lots and lots of layers in a very tightly wound sandwich. In that case, there are also other configurations. You can have the thin layers folded into a Z-fold, kind of like a book. That would be a prismatic cell, and there are other designs as well. And each of those layers is a different material, which means that recycling it is much more complicated than just recycling, your magazines or something like that. And you can put a single cell is something that you might have in your phone. You might have two cells in your laptop. In a vehicle, you've got a bunch of cells put together into groups called modules, and those modules are put together into a big pack. And the upper right-hand corner there is a battery pack from a Chevrolet Bolt. I've got it. Why they named them that way, I don't know, but it just makes things confusing. And you can see some of the modules, and the little black things are individual cells, which are prismatic cells in this case. Next slide. Oh, once a battery gets to its end of life in your vehicle, people need to test it and see how good it is so they can figure out where to go. And what's likely to happen is you'll take the battery pack apart into modules, not all the way down to cells, because that ends up being very labor intensive. I mean, a Tesla might have something like 5,000 cells, and they might even be glued into the module. So taking it apart is just not going to be worth the money in labor. So the modules then get graded to see which ones are good. If they're really good ones, you can put them back into a battery pack to put into a car whose battery has failed, or you can put good modules or less good modules into a second life application, depending what you want to do with it, and I'll get to that in a sec. Or if it's not really very good at all, you'll just send it to recycling directly. Next. So what do you do with a second life battery? Well, one thing you can do with it is put it in a big stack of batteries and give it to the utility company. And if you've got solar energy that's building up during the course of the day, but you really need power at night, you can store the energy in this pack of battery packs. Or you can take it and put it in a remote charger. If you do that, you can again store solar energy you've collected during the day and charge batteries at night off of this charging station. One idea that we had, which you're welcome to try and we can help you with it, is I was thinking about one bus company that's putting in electric buses, and they have enough charging stations in their depot to charge something like 6 buses, but they're about to get a number of additional buses, and they don't really have the capacity. And if they put in more chargers and used grid power all at once to charge the batteries, they might run into extremely large demand charges for taking a lot of power at the same time. If they had battery storage and can store energy from a different time of day in those batteries, they could charge all of their buses overnight without running into a large demand charge. So you can also use second life batteries for golf carts and Segways and So there are all kinds of places you can use them. And I have to make a plug here for the frequently asked questions that we put together for Clean Cities. Thank you, Jared, about Second Life batteries. Next slide. So we were also asked what happens to batteries that reach their end of life. Well, first thing to note is that in the United States, at least, essentially all of the batteries that have reached their end of life so far are from your portable electronics. There have not been that many EVs that have been in service for 10 or 12 or 15 years, so they haven't really gotten to their ends of life. So this graph shows Europe and the US and China, and you can see that in China, there actually have been a number of EV batteries that have gotten to their end of life. And if you follow these graphs to the right in projections that you can't see in this, they all go up on the right, especially the Chinese one. And very quickly after the edge of these graphs, the electric vehicle batteries totally dominate in number and in capacity the supply of batteries coming out of life. Next. And I've just included this graph to show you that even though some batteries are coming out of service at the end of their warranted lives, in fact, battery vehicles and most vehicles are kept in service way longer than you might think. And the peak age of vehicles that are being taken out of service is something like 20 years. So it shouldn't be at all surprising that a lot of EVs have not gotten to be ready to be recycled. Next. And I've shown this because I was frankly shocked by the magnitude of how far ahead of us the Chinese are in all of these EV-related activities. This is recycling capacity, and as of now, Chinese recycling capacity is really something like 100 times US capacity. I'm not sure what we do with that, but there is capacity coming online in the US at this point, belatedly. Next. And the interesting thing also that comes out straight out of the math is because the growth of electric vehicles and because of that battery manufacture is so rapid, it turns out that recycling plants will have it for quite a while now as their main feedstock, scrap from manufacturing. And that's just because there's so much more material being manufactured right now than there is compared to 10 or 15 years ago. Next. So Jared mentioned cobalt, one of the main functions that DOE has in order to reduce the US dependence on critical materials is to reduce the amount of cobalt in batteries. So that's a major research effort for the Department of Energy. They've also got a battery recycling prize. Basically what happened with that was they figured out when we started looking at how the batteries were going to be recycled that you didn't have to worry about how they were going to be recycled if you couldn't get them back in the first place. So the battery recycling prize was established to figure out how to get all of these batteries back. And finally, the third part of their program is our Resell Center, which is a $15 million over 3-year collaboration with 3 national labs. Argonne is the lead lab. NREL and Oak Ridge also have important parts. And we also have 3 university partners that are doing very interesting work. And the center's mission is to come up with an economical way to recycle lithium-ion batteries from vehicles within 3 years, start taking cells and recycling them to get new cells. Next. Now, it's not that nobody knows how to recycle batteries at this point. There are 2 commercial processes. Pyrometallurgical processing, basically you take the battery, you throw it into a big furnace, treat it like an ore, and you get back to that refining stage. Or you can take the battery, chop it up, dissolve it in strong acid, and you can get back precursors to battery materials. What we want to do is actually get back the valuable internal materials from the battery with their crystalline structure intact so that we can avoid doing the energy intensive steps that need to get repeated from the other processes. And that again is one of those smaller circles that's better for the environment from the circular economy methodology. So we're working on that, and we've got a number of processes that we're working on to get material back that will be attractive to battery manufacturers. Next. And what we've shown, and this sort of demonstrates what we were saying about circular economy. This is essentially from an extended life cycle analysis model that we have. And what we're showing is that the direct process, which is the gray bars in this chart, has the lowest impacts in all of the categories that we've shown here, which are cost, energy consumption, and emissions and water consumption, compared to making the batteries from scratch or from either of the commercial recycling processes. So we're hoping that we can get this completed and demonstrated so that when there do get to be a lot of batteries coming back, we'll be able to recycle them economically in the US. Next. And I just wanted to thank our sponsors at the Vehicle Technologies Office. This picture was the kickoff meeting for the center something like a year and a half ago, yeah. And you can see people from all of the institutions involved and our DOE sponsors. So that's all I have, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Linda. Just a quick reminder to everyone, keep putting your questions in the Q&A box. That's great. We've got a really great stack for the end of the webinar. We're going to try to run through these last 2 presentations, and we'll get to everyone's questions for the presenters at the end of the event. So thank you for doing that. Up next, we have Jason Quinn. Jason is an associate professor in mechanical engineering at Colorado State University. And when he's not working, he can be found on a Western river. So thank you, Jason. Take it away.
Yeah, thanks for that. So yeah, again, my name's Jason. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm really grateful for everybody who are here to talk about something that all of us are really passionate about. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. So if we go to the next slide, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about all the great people who enable this work to be done, all the sponsors that sponsor this work, as well as the different collaborators that we have. And if we go to the next slide, I will put a shameless plug for a new engineering research center that has been funded, that I'm a part of. It's led out of the Utah State University in Logan, Utah, a former home of mine. And so a lot of really great stuff to come on electrification of vehicles, roadways, and infrastructure. If you're interested, the website is there, and I would encourage you to check it out. So I think that we'll do an interactive portion real quick. So if we go to the next slide, I'm curious how many people have one of these in their backyard, right? This is a virtual thing, or how many people use this as a primary form of transportation? My guess is of the 70 plus here, there aren't a lot of people who are raising their hands, right? If we go to the next slide, I think that most people have one of these, right? And if we go to the next slide, I think there's even a large fraction of people in this room that have something that look like this. And I think we're at a really exciting point, right? Is that it's cool to see some of those hands go up on this slide, but what does it take to get more up? So on the next slide, I just kind of detailed that we've been here before. A couple of years ago for for some of us might even remember these times, right? There was the Federal Highway Act. And the Federal Highway Act, there's an animation here, cost us about $500 billion. And that was a huge investment at the time. And so the question is, can we make that investment again? Or are we gonna make that again? And so on the next slide, I think the answer is we're there. Like, electric vehicles are here. This is Car and Driver Vehicle of the Year in 2008, right? So that is a while ago, but it's exciting. GM is making announcements about electrification. Toyota's making announcement about electrification. So it's coming. It's just a matter of kind of what that looks like. And that's the research that I'm excited about. So a lot of you, especially in the first poll, right, on the next slide, have identified the issues. And if you click through these animations, they'll show up quickly, right? They're all the things everybody knows and loves, right? Can I afford it? Where do I plug it in? How am I going to get there, right? And these are all real things. The problem is that a lot of what we perceive isn't necessarily reality, right? In terms of range anxiety, for example. COVID's unique, but I think the furthest I've driven during COVID is like 3 miles, other than going to the mountains to ski, right? But you know, otherwise, I'm just really wearing out the sidewalks these days. And so on the next slide, I present some of the solutions that exist today, right? So what's pictured here is the Tesla model. It's a unique model, right? It's basically duplicating the gas can or the gas tank, right? We're gonna have all our energy storage on board, but there's other solutions, overhead catenary cables, connected roadway systems. But my vision for what the future looks like is on the next slide. And so I'd like you to take a minute to look at this and see what you see. What do you notice? My hope is that it doesn't look anything different than what you already do. And I think that's what the key is in order for us to move forward with electrification. And keep in mind what you paid for this seminar, and more importantly, that I'm just one guy with one opinion. And so if we go to the next slide, this is what's being illustrated. This is in motion wireless charging. And so the concept is that if those who have camera, right, like I charge my phone on a pad wirelessly. Well, let's just elevate it and just drive it at 75 miles an hour across the interstate. Kind of a cool concept. A lot of challenges, but something that's kind of cool. And it addresses a lot of those anxiety things that we've talked about, but it's a huge infrastructure investment. But it's okay, we've been there before. So what are we doing to investigate this? So if we click forward 2 slides, my work focuses on the optimization of systems considering sustainability. So I'm really grateful to the DOE for 2 reasons. One is they give us a lot of money to look into this, but 2 is no matter who is in the administration, they care about 2 things. It's a matter of what comes first: economics and environmental impact. So the last 4 years, it's been in that order. In the next 4 years, I'm predicting it's going to be environmental impact and economics. But this is the core expertise that we play in. And specifically, we're looking at some complicated figures here. The one on the left looks at energy consumption in LA. And the cool thing is about LA, because I don't live there, is that there's a lot of traffic. And when there's a lot of traffic, you don't go very fast, which means you don't consume a lot of energy. So you don't see these huge spikes at 5 o'clock when the grid is already stressed. So that was kind of a unique thing from us on that work. And the thing on the right is infrastructure deployment and what that might look like over the course of a 30-year period for something like in-motion wireless transport. So I've got a couple more slides to just illustrate and reinforce some of the things that our fine folks at Argonne talked about. So when we look at costs, on the left are all the details. If you click go, here's the answer, right? And the answer is that, yeah, it's cheaper to operate an electric vehicle for a variety of reasons. If we go to the next slide, we're going to talk about environmental impact. So just confirming everything Jared said, hey, SOx, it's an issue, right? But GHGs are not. And so it depends on what we care about. So if we click go again, check it out. Here's the answer for the takeaways, right? Yep, there's a huge reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. But as Jared said, that's not the whole picture. It's a big part of the picture. And so as we move forward, we can start to use this information to try to make intelligent decisions. I've got one more kind of very technical slide on the next one, and this is just illustrating all the different payback scenarios that we're investigating. What is the technology performance required? How much does the consumer need to pay in order to get this infrastructure paid back? What do the emissions look like over 30 years based on different adoption scenarios? And so what I'm trying to convince you here of is that the future is uncertain. There's no doubt. If I knew what it was going to look like, I'm not going to lie, I wouldn't be here hanging out with y'all, right? But that's one of the reasons why we do the work we do, is we're trying to look at what the options are and what's going to be ideal. And so my last slide is this, is that we're at a unique position. If you look at this, the cost is about 2 times what we spent 60 years ago. But as we go forward, and if you click one more slide, I see an evolution, right? We used to walk, and then we captured horses, and now vehicles, and now we're moving into electric vehicles. And my hope, my dream, right, is that for me to come back here, 5 years from now and be able to ask the first question that I asked, and if you click ahead one more, is to see all the hands raised when they're like, yeah, I drive an electric vehicle and I love it. So that's the research we're doing, and we're really excited about it. So thanks so much for your time, and I look forward to the questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Jason. The future is now, right? That's all very exciting. Great. Well, next we have, and last but not least, we have Jesse Burkhart, assistant professor in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at Colorado State University. So Jesse, take it away.
Thanks. Yeah, so this talk is called The Economics of Electric Vehicles. How clean are they really? Go ahead and advance the slide. So the questions I was asked to talk about are, how are EVs being powered? Coal energy versus renewables? Where is the energy coming from, and who's producing the energy? So I kind of boiled this down into one main question of how clean are electric vehicles? And I'm gonna often say EVs instead of electric vehicles. Go ahead and advance the slide. So to answer this question, I'm going to review one paper in economics, because I'm an economist, on this topic. It's a paper by Stephen Holland. It was published in 2016, so the results are maybe slightly old, but I think they're still relevant for the electricity sector today. The paper is called, Are There Environmental Benefits from Driving Electric Vehicles? The Importance of Local Factors, and it was published in the American Economic Review. Go ahead and advance the slide. Okay, so how clean are electric vehicles? The considerations this paper is talking about are global pollution, which we'll define as greenhouse gases, local pollution, which is pollutants that don't travel necessarily all over the world, things like PM2.5, PM10, ozone, SO2, and VOCs, or volatile organic compounds. And this paper's primary focus is the local pollution. There's differences in local pollution for gasoline and electric vehicles for the following reasons. Gasoline is burned at the location the car is driven, and so the local pollutants are they're burdening the people around where the gasoline car is driven. In contrast, coal and natural gas may be burned up to maybe 500 miles away from where the electric vehicle is driven, so it's displacing local emissions damages from electric vehicles. The extent of local emissions damages depends on where the cars are driven as well. So urban versus rural, essentially who's being exposed. If you drive a gas-powered vehicle in an urban area, you're exposing many more people than you would be if you drove that same car in a rural area. So we have to think about that. And pollution is often exported across political jurisdictions like state lines. So if you're a policymaker in a state thinking about state level subsidies or taxes for electric vehicles or gas-powered vehicles, you need to think, are you considering the damages from pollution to people within your state or people outside your state as well? So we'll talk about both those things. All right, next slide. Okay, so this slide is meant to give you a sense of how local pollutants are exported across state lines. So these graphs are simulated changes in PM2.5 from an additional 10,000 Ford Focuses in Fulton County, Georgia. The gas-powered is on the left, the electric vehicles are on the right. So on the left, you can see that there's a dark red blob right in where Fulton County, Georgia is, and that's showing that the highest change in PM2.5 from these additional 10,000 gas-powered Ford Focuses is right there in Fulton County, Georgia. You get some spillover to the neighboring states, the green, but not nearly as much as what you see in the graph on the right, the lower one, where we have the simulated 10,000 additional electric vehicle Ford Focuses. And In this case, the largest change in PM 2.5 is actually coming from North Carolina, where there's that little orange dot, and that's because that's where the majority of the electricity is being produced to power those additional 10,000 electric vehicles. And also the extent of leakage across state lines is much larger with these electric vehicles. So that's what this paper is considering. And one thing that we need to think about if we're considering how clean are electric vehicles relative to gasoline. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the bottom line policy result, if we're thinking about how to incentivize purchases of electric vehicles, is the optimal EV subsidy should be equal to the difference in lifetime damages between an electric vehicle and a gas vehicle. So if we were to subsidize electric vehicles, economic theory would say that we want to make a person just indifferent between purchasing the gas-powered versus electric vehicle, maybe pushing them slightly over to the EV side. And this paper asks, what are those lifetime damages and how do they differ by region of the US? So next slide. Some results up front. This has already been mentioned, but if only accounting for greenhouse gases, EVs are environmentally superior almost everywhere across the US. But if we account for local pollutants, the optimal national subsidy is actually negative $1,095 or a tax. So for example, but this differs depending on where you are in the US, and this has also already been mentioned. But in California, with relatively clean energy, where energy is produced with hydro, lots of renewables and natural gas, and high local pollutant damages, in other words, there's large population centers, the optimal subsidy is $2,785. In North Dakota, with relatively dirty energy, a lot of energy produced with coal, and low local pollutant damages, not many people are exposed when you drive a gas-powered vehicle, the optimal subsidy is actually about negative $5,000 or a $5,000 tax. And these are state level subsidies. Another thing is that 91% of local pollutant damages from electric vehicles are exported across state lines, sort of like what we were seeing in that a couple slides ago with those two maps. In contrast, only 19% of local pollutant damages from gasoline cars are exported across state lines. So not accounting for these exports, if you're deciding what state level subsidy to make, if you don't account for the exports across state lines, the best environmental or electric vehicle subsidy is positive in 32 states. If we account for these exports, then the best electric vehicle subsidy is positive in only 11 states. Okay, next slide. Okay, these two figures are showing county level local and global emissions damages from gasoline powered vehicles on the left and electric vehicles on the right. And so now they're presenting the damage estimates from additional gas powered and electric vehicles. You can see on the left for the gas powered vehicles, the higher damages, the red, those are localized to population centers like San Francisco, LA, San Diego, Chicago, New York, Atlanta. In contrast, the graph on the figure on the right or the bottom, this is the damages from electric vehicles, and these are, what's interesting here is that you have these kind of uniform damage areas, right? The west is all green, and the reason here is that is because these are interconnected electricity grids, and so if you charge an electric vehicle basically anywhere within the western region, the marginal unit of electricity is produced from the same generator, and so the marginal damages from charging an electric vehicle anywhere in the west are going to be basically the same, and it's lowest in the west and in Texas, in fact. The highest marginal or the highest local pollutant damages from charging electric vehicles are in the upper Midwest, all the way out to Pennsylvania, sort of given by the dark red there. Okay, next slide. Okay, these two figures show the optimal state level electric vehicle subsidies accounting for pollution spillovers on the left. We can see that if we account for pollution spillovers, there's a lot of places where the optimal subsidy is actually negative. It's a tax. Those are the areas in red and orange and even yellow. If we do not account for these pollution spillovers, then we have optimal subsidies that are positive in most places. This is the graph or the map on the lower right. So we have a lot more areas where the optimal subsidies are positive there. Okay, next slide. Some qualifications of this study. So these are simulated estimates of damages, and there's some assumptions in any simulation, and so some of these assumptions I wanted to go over so we can maybe think about how changing the assumptions might change the estimates of these optimal subsidies and damages. So one thing is the types of vehicles being considered, right? So if we have a Ford F-150 versus a Chevy Volt versus a Ford Focus versus a Chevy Volt, this paper is looking at replacing a Ford Focus with a Chevy Volt. And if we were to get people that drove Ford F-150s to replace them with Chevy Volts, then this would look a lot different because the F-150s are a lot dirtier than Ford Focuses. This paper uses a social cost of carbon of $41 per ton. The current estimates are well above $50 per ton. So then if we increase the social cost of carbon, we would get probably different estimates. The analysis is based on an electricity grid from 2010 to 2012. The electricity grid is really dynamic. We're seeing more renewables every year. So this probably, electric vehicles are probably looking better already. And it depends on when the EV is charged. This is probably one of the more important ones. This paper assumes that customers charge at night. And it could be the case that the marginal damages or the marginal emissions are lower at peak periods when maybe we have solar power. And so if we can get people to charge at different times of the day, we could potentially do better. And it also considers a marginal electric vehicle with few electric vehicles on the road. So as we get more EVs, the grid will expand and these estimates will differ. Okay, one more slide. In conclusion, if we only consider global emissions, greenhouse gases, EVs look better than gas-powered vehicles. But this paper kind of highlights that if we consider local emissions, there's lots of variation, and it depends on how the electricity is produced and whether the vehicles are driven in population centers. Electric vehicles look better as electricity production becomes cleaner, and we can coordinate charging times with periods of lower electricity emissions. And this analysis ignores the possibility of long-term benefits from today's investments, like the benefits of subsidies providing technological innovation. All right, I'll end there, and I'll answer any questions that people have.
Great. Thank you so much, Jesse. Yeah, we do have quite a few questions for all of you presenters. So thank you all for sharing your ideas and your work. It's all been really valuable. So digging into some of these questions, first for Jared, what do you think the pros and cons of GREET are compared to Omega in regulating? And could you maybe give a little background on what GREET and Omega are, just for people who might not know?
Well, I can tell you what GREET is. I'm not aware of what Omega is. Is it an LCA tool?
The question doesn't say. I would assume.
Because I searched Omega in life cycle analysis, and it didn't get any hits. GREET is an LCA tool that we've developed at Argonne since 1995. It has a lot of background data that can help decision makers make choices. There are a number of additional LCA tools out there like Gabby, and there are just a variety of different tools. And so whether you use one or another is going to affect your results somewhat, but in broad strokes, you'll usually come out to comparative similarity. And that's the key with LCAs. It's always comparative. You compare against things that are on equal footing in some capacity, right? Like they have a functional unit that's the same. So
Certainly.
If whoever it was wants to, actually, it was Noel. Is it Noise? I saw the question. Sorry.
We should also mention that GREET is publicly available and totally transparent. It's all documented, and so you can tell where the data came from, and it gets updated every year.
Yeah, that was from.
And it's used by a very large number of institutions. So it's a good baseline that's very transparent and accessible.
Yeah, I was going to say if Christian Noyce wants to put his question, like what omega is, in the chat, that could be helpful. But I noticed, so I'm looking at some of the questions, and he had a few more. Should we address those, or Dre, are you going to just walk us through?
I'll walk us through them. I guess, Jared, if you want to keep answering the question, do you have a plot of overall greenhouse gas life cycle emissions of BEVs compared to
Sure.
ICEVs, like
Yeah,
SOx?
yeah, we've got like a ton of those. I just grabbed an old presentation, and if I can share my screen, I'll just throw up something from a 2015 paper. So it's dated, but Linda was one of the other authors on this paper. Oh, I'm not able to share screen. It's disabled. So.
We can make you the host really quick, or a co-host, so that you can share your screen. You can also feel free to
Go now.
link it into the chat.
Okay, gotcha. Screen 2. So right here, let me get bigger. So yeah, so this is from and I'll throw a link to the article in the chat. But again, this is a 2015 paper, so these things do change a little bit over time, right? We learn a lot more about the parts of the vehicle. We get better information about resources and where they're coming from. Right now, we're doing a big update on lithium, so understanding all the different ways that lithium can be obtained and what the effects are in terms of energy, emissions, et cetera. And what you're looking at here is a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle with a 50-mile range. And this is a battery electric vehicle. And if I remember correctly, this is more like a 100-mile range BEV, since it was 2015. And this is an internal combustion engine vehicle. So these are all like basically comparable. So these vehicles all have the same, acceleration and things like that. And so you can see.
Seeing the screen, Jared.
What's that?
We're not seeing a screen.
Oh, okay. Oh, I see. Gotcha. Screen now?
Mm-hmm.
Good to go.
Sorry about that. My sincere apologies. You go through Zoom, Teams, Blue Jeans. They're all different in what you do. Okay, sorry about that. So what I was pointing to is P50, BEV, and ICEV right here. So these are just the greenhouse gas emissions. So you can see that they are very comparable in terms of the energy. So, and I'll throw a link to the paper, this paper in there. But we've got more up-to-date versions of this too. This was just easy to access. So.
Great. This might have been directed at Linda, but maybe all of you have an answer for this. What other chemistries or materials are being explored in lieu of cobalt?
Well, there are also the Nissan Leaf was a lithium manganese oxide chemistry, so there's no cobalt in that one. A lot of the Chinese cars and some of the ones that Tesla says it's going to make are lithium iron phosphate. Again, no cobalt. But for high performance passenger cars, nobody has yet produced one that doesn't have any cobalt in it. The Chevy Volt was an NMC 111, which meant it had equal amounts of cobalt, nickel, and manganese in it. What they're moving towards now is, as Jared mentioned, higher nickel, and a typical one that people are talking about is 811, which has 8 times as much nickel as cobalt or manganese. And in fact, DOE's doing some research on chemistries that have half as much cobalt as that in them. So it's coming. I don't know how much cobalt's really going to be used when, but one thing to note is the total amount of cobalt that we're using, even as the amount per battery decreases, is still increasing because the number of batteries is increasing so fast.
All right, this one's for Jason. Why wireless overhead charging versus wired overhead charging? From my understanding, they'd cost about the same, but wireless has more phantom energy loss due to the basic physics of magnets and batteries.
Yeah. So it's in-ground wireless, right? So these pads we buried in the roadway. And so I just want to, I'm pretty sure that's just kind of a bit of a typo. It's a great question. And it's stuff we're looking into to understand, what those cost difference look like and the feasibility. Ultimately, it's the simplicity of it, right? And so when you look at wireless power transfer, air gap dictates what that efficiency is. Right now, we're modeling that efficiency at 86%. Whereas if you have open area catenary cables, that is obviously high 90s. And so you do have that efficiency loss. But there's the simplicity aspect to it as well. You can also deal with incremental weather through wireless power transfer. So they all have advantages and disadvantages, and that's the work we're doing, is we're exploring what those look like and how people would adopt the technologies differently, and the feasibility of adoption, and the impacts on the environment and the economic viability. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, and then Jason, if you wouldn't mind continuing, this is sort of related. Would you be talking about fission or fusion gen sets along the roadside?
So I did a master's degree at Wisconsin on fusion-based energy research, and so it's near and dear to my heart. One of the challenges we have moving forward is we've got an archaic grid. We really, we can't pass a lot of energy from different sectors, and that represents a huge challenge. So this infrastructure deployment that we're talking about could address some of those limitations in terms of power piping. Ultimately, you'd be leveraging, local energy resources. And so in the state of Wyoming, just north of us, it's a little windy from time to time. And so, that's a resource you can leverage during those points. We're not really going to the level of whether we would be deploying nuke energy and where that would be deployed. We're just kind of looking at what the increase in grid energy would be. And if you're a utility, it's exciting because this represents a ridiculous amount of growth. That's a lot of potential revenue and income, jobs, all of those things. Because, instead of anyway, I'll stop there. So thanks again. That's a good question.
Thank you. Maybe Jesse can speak a little bit to this one, or if you all have thoughts, feel free to jump in. But how much would electrification of the heavy duty sector impact pollution in low-income communities? How would electrification of, say, off-road farming equipment impact localized PM?
So I would need to know a little more specifics about what you mean by the heavy duty sector.
Well, the example that the question gives is farming equipment, but I know like at Northern Colorado Clean Cities, we talk a lot about transit trucks or 18-wheelers, things like that, things larger and more utility oriented than just a consumer vehicle like Chevy Volt or Ford Fusion.
Okay, yeah. There's actually, I mean, I'm not an expert on that, but there's a fair amount of research, even in economics, on that question. And I know that people have looked into which socioeconomic sectors are more impacted by these local pollutants like PM. I would say for farming, though, probably the largest impact would be the dust from farming, rather than driving one tractor, because you're kicking up a ton of dust, which is going to travel quite a ways, and you're also not. Farming is kind of by definition in a rural area, so you're not exposing many people, and so I think really this question is probably more appropriate for the urban areas, who's being disproportionately exposed in the urban areas. And I don't know off the top of my head, but I know that there is research on that topic.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks, Jesse. So this one might go back to Linda and Jared. Beyond battery recycling, how can EVs better assimilate into the DIY car maintenance culture, including those within resource-restricted communities?
I mean, I can take a stab at that. I think that let's look at carburetors, for example. I think those are pretty scary devices. And for those who have ever had an opportunity to actually, I've only broken them, to be honest with everybody here, just because they're so complicated. It was on a 1980s jet ski. It was super fun. I learned a lot, right? Is that, I mean, electric vehicles are coming and they're here, right? And so I know somebody who converted a BMW into a fully electric, BEV, right? And that was, he just wanted to do it because it was fun for him. And so it's just, it's gonna happen, and people are gonna tinker, and people are gonna do great things, and people are gonna adapt to the new technologies, in my opinion. And the same as my little brother, changes his oil. I think when he gets an electric vehicle, he is gonna hack it to do things because that's what he enjoys doing. So I look at it as an opportunity to learn something new, personally. So I don't know if that answers the question. But.
Excuse me, there certainly is a market for used batteries now for do-it-yourselfers. Apparently the prices are getting bumped up because there's so much demand. I'm not sure how that relates to the question, but that market, people are using them now.
Yeah, certainly. And that's actually a good segue into this next question. What kind of regulatory incentives are there for second life battery rate arbitrage or overcharge shaving? Does that make sense? It's in the Q&A if you need to read it too.
So I can talk briefly. I've got a project that we're working on that's funded by DOE ARPA-E, which is specifically looking at second life batteries from electric vehicles, basically reconditioning those batteries and then plugging those into energy storage systems for grid management. And we've looked at, I think ultimately the deal is that it's either economically viable or it's not, and that's what's going to dictate whether it gets adopted or not. So in all the modeling work we're doing now, we aren't including any sort of incentives for that deployment. We're just looking at whether it's economically viable with current grid structures. So that's the extent of my knowledge.
This might be a more general question. I think it was probably aimed toward Jared. Do you have an average wheel-to-well energy efficiency for internal combustion engines? Oh, I think you're muted, Jared.
Yeah, it's basically the plot that I showed. So, I mean, if we're thinking about it that way, right? So I don't have that number like on the top of my head, but we know that the internal combustion engine is about 20% efficient, and then you're losing a variety of efficiency and as you go. But if you look at the energy, so I showed energy in over energy out. So that's basically the efficiency, right, in terms of a life cycle. So the plot that I showed in like the 5th slide, I think, is basically the answer to that.
Great. So just a few more questions here. I want to be sensitive to people's time also. This is also a more general question I think you all can probably speak to, but are the environmental benefits of operating an EV outweighed by the environmental costs of producing it, especially if my ICE vehicle still has useful life and I drive less than 20 miles a week? I know this is a question we get all the time at NCCC, so if you guys have any tips or tricks to answer that one, definitely speak up.
Yeah, if you don't drive, don't buy a new car. All of the studies that show that the per mile impacts of driving are much lower for an EV are dependent on the fact that you're actually driving it. But if you already have a car and you're not really driving it, they're very low impacts and you're not going to win by buying a new car.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think I'll add on that. Yeah, I think if you're driving it a lot, obviously it's more environmentally beneficial to get an EV. But at Northern Colorado Clean Cities, we're absolutely fuel neutral, and so if you're not driving a ton and you don't have the means or the resources, or if you don't drive that much, then yeah, I don't think that there's anything blatantly wrong with not buying an EV, but you definitely have to look at it case to case for that kind of thing. And then we'll just end with kind of a fun one looking into the future. What research is being done on e-bikes and their impact compared to e-cars? Obviously, they're very different mechanically, but what are your thoughts on micromobility and the advancements that can be made there?
So we've done some looking at this from a couple of different perspectives, not necessarily from the LCA perspective, just at use and that sort of thing. I do know of work out of NC State. Jeremiah Johnson would have been the lead on that where they actually done an LCA looking at the e-bike itself or the e-scooters. I don't have necessarily a holistic sort of comment or thought on that. If it's getting people to take public transit, if it's solving the last mile problem, then it's probably a good thing. If it's replacing people going for a walk, then it would be not a good thing, right? So I don't know. I don't have a great answer for that one. And we don't have any specific, I don't have any specific projects looking at that.
I'd assume the idea was they would take an e-bike instead of driving, in which case, presumably the impacts are way lower. I have been actually at a conference all week virtually, and there was one person that was extolling the virtues of micromobility. And I actually commented to him that the temperature here was 2 degrees and micromobility was great, but I thought it would be a problem in certain areas of the country at certain times.
I can tell you for sure, they're still putting the divvy bikes out, the new electrified divvy bikes in Chicago. There's mountains of snow and it's like 6 degrees, but they're out there.
Yeah, it was definitely snowing this morning and I still biked to campus, so won't stop everybody. Okay, I said that was the last question. I lied. We're going to do one more. This one's a little out there also. I know you guys, not all of you work in infrastructure so much, but maybe we can broaden it to EV adoption in general. But how do you balance installing EV infrastructure or adopting EVs or promoting them to low-income communities and communities of color with fears of gentrification? And how have you seen the stigmas starting to break down around EVs and who drives them and where do they exist and things like that, especially while there's still gaps in overall network at the city and regional level?
Yeah, I can start to try to answer some of that. Oh, you moved the question. I was trying to look at the question so that I could make sure I was addressing it.
I can jump in real quick. I think this is a really tough one, and I bet that anybody that's in local or state government is really wrestling with this. We have in Colorado, I know the Colorado Electric Vehicle Coalition. I bet there's people on that, maybe even some of them are here, that are wrestling with this question. The short answer for me is I don't know, but Jared, that was my 2 cents. I'll let you answer now.
Yeah, I can't say that I know, right? But there is I do know that in like Sacramento, there's a project where they have there's like charging and shared EVs, if I'm remembering correctly, within a low-income community, and I think it's I think in some ways it's there's not going to be a danger of that gentrifying. I would not be able to move into that community, right? Like you have to be low income to be in that community. And so that could be like one thought is like, but I don't really know. So there's that one, and there's also a similar thing in Salt Lake City. But I think that those are real issues. So I don't know how you make that balance. In terms of vehicle acquisition, one of the things I didn't point out to in our talk was that there are a lot of used EV, available used EV credits, and California did a nice job with their structure on their basic efficiency credit, where they did tie it to income. And so the amount of benefit that you could get to purchase a more efficient vehicle, and so that could be translated to an EV, and especially it could be translated to used EV, was based on the amount of income that your household made.
I think that's a great point. And I would just add, you know, we want to be mindful with where we put infrastructure as well. And even with concerns of gentrification, we need to make sure that they have access. Every community has access to charging. And Jared, that's a great point to mention access to EVs, because why build the infrastructure if accessibility to purchasing or owning an EV or a used EV is too out of reach. So I think if we can combine both of those efforts, we can try to come up with some solutions that way.
And one thing just popped into my mind with Blue LA. I'm not super familiar with it, but I'm from what I understand, they have some sort of shared EV program in Los Angeles that has there's greater access in low-income communities, and there's some sort of I don't know, reduced cost to the system for low-income households. But I'm not super plugged in on it.
Well, thank you for all of those answers. Those were all really insightful and interesting, and I hope people are inspired to keep thinking about these things. I think that's all the questions we have time for today, and I think right before we have everybody hop off, we have one more set of poll questions for you, if you don't mind. Joe, do you want to launch those really quick? Awesome. So if you have time right here at the end, fill out the poll questions. We'll review those results really quick, and that'll be about it. But thank you, everybody, for being here and for all of your wonderful questions. They were really, really interesting.
And just as people are filling out the poll, I'll just remind everybody that we will send a follow-up email with presentation slides, as well as the video recording and any other useful links that the panelists think would be helpful. So thank you all very much for taking the time to complete this post-presentation poll. And thank you for attending this event today.
All right, that looks like about all we're gonna get. All right, what do we think the EV industry needs to focus on more to improve sustainability and equity? Pretty evenly split here, but looks like renewables on the grid kind of takes the cake. Not a surprise there. Looks like a lot of people getting good information from the newsletter and webinars. That's good information for us to know. What EV topic would people be most interested in seeing in the future? EV accessibility in rural communities and dealerships. All right, that's interesting. That's definitely good to know. We plan on doing more of these in the future for those of you who are still with us. So definitely keep your eyes peeled for more events like this coming up. This is definitely a discussion we want to keep having, and bring in more experts and more people and more organizations to keep talking about these things. So these will all be topics we cover in the future. All right, and then we'll follow up with some of you on some of your remaining questions. So thank you all for being here. This has been a really wonderful event. Thank you to all the speakers and for joining us and sharing your wisdom. So thank you to everybody, and I think that's where we'll leave off.
Thank you. Have a great day.